Hey guys, welcome back to another video. It has certainly been a long time. I have not really been making content lately. I've been absolutely obsessed with playing this game. I hope that you're enjoying Diablo 4 so far, and today I kind of wanted to talk about the Sorcerer. The community at large is pretty much in agreement that the Sorcerer is the worst class. And so I wanted to dive into that today because a lot of people have been re-rolling and just picking a different class. And it kind of depends on what your goals are in this game. I don't necessarily think that you need to re-roll unless your goal is to really push higher tier nightmare dungeons. And so today we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of playing the Sorcerer. So to start with the pros, the build that I've been playing at least is the Arclash Sorcerer, which has absolutely no dependency whatsoever on resource. You're just spamming your basic skill all the time, and as boring as that might sound, it's actually a pretty good time. In fact, half the time that I encounter the Butcher, he is so terrified to even look at me that he runs for the entire fight. Alright, so seriously, to move into some of the pros, the first one that I want to talk about are barriers. Barriers are absolutely insane in this game, prevent you from taking damage, and we have so many of them. We have a lot of defense for a class that you would kind of expect to be a little bit squishy. Now, one of the things that I really love about barriers is how they remove poisons. Every time that I get poisoned, it looks like I'm absolutely dead. My health is just depleting so fast, and you see that kind of goldish brown color on your health bar, and you just know that you are bleeding out. But using a barrier just completely removes it, and effectively all of my skills 1 through 4 add a barrier. But the next pro for the Sorcerer, and this may be the biggest one for the entire class, is our crowd control. Fights against basic enemies and elites are great on the Sorcerer. We can teleport in, we can stun everything immediately. Once that's wearing off, we can Frost Nova. Pretty much the entire time we're fighting basic enemies and elites, they are just under crowd control. And the next thing that I want to talk about for the Sorcerer is just how powerful all of our defensive skills are. In fact, the vast majority of Sorcerers on their 1 through 4 are just using the entire defensive skill tree. Now, one of the great things about all of these defensive skills is protection. Each time we use a cooldown, any skill 1 through 4, we're going to gain a barrier for 30% of our life for 2 seconds. Now, although that doesn't sound like a lot of time, it actually really adds up because we're going to go in, we're going to use one defensive skill, then the next, and then the next, and so on and so forth. We're stacking a lot of cooldown reduction, and so we're constantly able to keep barriers up and stay safe. Now, the fact that almost all Sorcerers are using all of these defensive skills tells us one of two things. Either they are too powerful, or the Sorcerer just doesn't have enough better options and is kind of just a squishy class if we're not using them. Now, before we move into the cons, there's one last pro that I would really like to take note of, and that is Raiment of the Infinite. This unique is absolutely incredible. This turns our teleport into a crowd control and a vacuum. This unique really changes the way that we approach the Sorcerer class, and I really do think that it is a great design. It is worth noting, however, as we move into the cons, that the remainder of the uniques that are there for the Sorcerer class are just a little bit underwhelming. More specifically, I do think that the gloves of the Illuminator and the Staff of Endless Rage, these Fireball uniques, seem really cool on paper. The problem is that even with a perfect 65% roll on this, it feels really underwhelming. Your Fireball just doesn't do any damage. I really hope that this is something that's on Blizzard's radar for Season 1 because I really do like the idea that they've got going on here. I think that they just need to make it a little bit more powerful. Now, one last unique that I'd like to take note of is Esu's Heirloom. This is actually pretty solid. I don't like it quite as much as the Raiment because it doesn't really change the way that we play all that much. Although we may evade more often, and it's really fun to get that nice burst of speed for 1 second, I don't always think that it's worth it to just evade in combat just to get some more crit going. The time that we spend in the evade animation just to get 1 second of some additional movement speed and crit doesn't necessarily always feel like it's worth just dropping off all of my damage to do an evade. But all things considered, it is still a great option for the Sorcerer. Okay, so moving on to some of the major problems with the Sorcerer class, the first thing that I want to talk about is we are an intelligence class. Now, of course, increasing our skill damage is really nice, and increases resistance to all elements sounds really nice on paper. If you were a Diablo 3 player or a D2 player, you would know that resistances are incredibly important. However, There is a huge problem in this game right now, and resistances are just not worth much at all. Several other content creators have made videos about this. I would highly recommend checking them out. Kriparian did a really good one where he kind of went over some comparisons of getting resistances versus additional armor or additional life on your character. Long story short, when it comes to this, resistances are just not good enough right now, and so the Sorcerer is a very squishy class. And of course, this does force us into playing all of these defensive skills. The next issue that I have with the Sorcerer, although we have phenomenal crowd control ability, our damage is entirely reliant on having enemies under crowd control. On top of that, vulnerable is one of the most important mechanics in the game. In order to really have a character who's going to thrive, you have to be constantly applying vulnerable to your enemies. The only reliable way for the Sorcerer to do this is with Frost Nova, which even at max rank and an additional 3 skill points has a 10.25 second cooldown. And of course, it only makes enemies vulnerable for 4 seconds or bosses up to 6. Now, of course, we do have other ways to reduce that cooldown, specifically with Glinting Arclash. As long as we are hitting a lot of stunned enemies, we can reduce that cooldown a bit more so that we can keep vulnerable up more often. The problem is that this isn't always reliable. This is really solid when you've got a big group of enemies that you've packed up with your teleport and you've stunned them for 3 seconds. However, when you're not fighting against a big pack and you're kind of fighting against certain stragglers, it's difficult for this class to deal with those because we don't want to use our Frost Nova to just apply vulnerable to a couple of targets. But if we don't, we're just killing them incredibly slowly. Vulnerable altogether is a totally different discussion, though that is for another video. However, one thing that I will note about it is that I think it's a little bit out of control right now, and it needs a little bit of work. If every class's damage completely relies on the enemies being vulnerable, Sorcerer is in a really weak spot, with Frost Nova being our best option. Now, for those of you who are interested in pushing Nightmare Dungeons, if that is your endgame goal and you want to get to the highest tier that you possibly can, for you, I would probably actually recommend considering rerolling. The Sorcerer is going to struggle the higher and higher that you go. You're eventually just going to get one shot, even with your barriers up. Now, when resistances eventually do get buffed, I would imagine that the Sorcerer would be a great contender in these Nightmare Dungeons, but right now, they're just not there. Pushing high-tier Nightmare Dungeons isn't necessarily my goal right now, and if it isn't your goal, then Sorcerer is a great class to continue forward with. But outside of Nightmare Dungeons, I do feel like this character is really strong, especially in Helltides. With this build, I'm always able to secure all of the mystery chests and have plenty of time left over. And on top of that, when it comes to just farming level 100 content or even open world content where the enemies are level 95, the Sorcerer feels really strong and really quick. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about when it comes to the cons for the Sorcerer is Frozen Orb. I'm really sad that this isn't good. This is a really iconic skill from back in Diablo 2 or people who played DMO in Diablo 3. Spacing is really important when you're playing Frozen Orb. You want that orb to explode on top of the enemies, and so you have to keep that spacing just right, especially if they're moving. You kind of have to predict their movement. I absolutely love DMO Frozen Orb in Diablo 3, and I'm so sad to see that this just isn't really competitive right now. But who knows though? Apparently Blizzard has 13 pages of patch notes coming out in the near future, and so maybe Frozen Orb will get a little bit of love. I would certainly love to see that and give it a try. Another major con about the Sorcerer is that we kind of actually only have one enchantment slot, and I want to talk about that a little bit. The first enchantment slot here is always Firebolt. Pretty much no matter what you're playing, unless your build naturally applies burn to enemies. So as a result, we only really get to pick one other enchantment because it is so important to apply burning to enemies. If we look at our skill tree here, we will see that we have 3 points into Devouring Blaze, and I have an extra point from an item. This is so important and absolutely essential for the Sorcerer's damage. If you're not playing a build that's burning enemies and using Devouring Blaze, you are missing out on a ton of damage. This feels absolutely essential for the Sorcerer right now, regardless of what you're playing. Even if your primary skills are Blizzard and Ice Shards, you have to be burning enemies. When it comes to min-maxing your character, I really feel like we are just required to go into Devouring Blaze right now because it is just too good to ignore. I'm not sure if this needs a nerf or if we just need some buffs to some of our other skills. Long story short, if you are really interested in pushing high-tier Nightmare Dungeons, this is not the build for you. But at the end of the day, it's all about having fun, and so even if this class is so much weaker than other classes when it comes to pushing high-tier Nightmare Dungeons, if you're having a good time just farming the open world, events, Helltides, dungeons, Nightmare Dungeons at your level, or even a bit higher, this is a great class for it. If I had the chance to go back in time and re-roll a different class on day 1, I can honestly say that I wouldn't. So to dive into my wish list for the Sorcerer, I am hoping that in Season 1 we see resistances fixed. I've heard a lot of people saying that might take until Season 2, which is really unfortunate, but it is incredibly important that this occurs. Next up, I would like to see the Sorcerer get some more useful uniques or build-defining uniques, and maybe rework those Fireball uniques so that we can actually make something happen without completely butchering our damage. And lastly, and this is a huge ask, and I'm not really sure that Blizzard's on board with it, maybe even the community is not on board with it, but I would love to see the 3rd enchantment slot come back. Originally, the Sorcerer did have 3 enchantment slots, and right now, because we are absolutely forced into using Firebolt, our synergies are incredibly limited with what we can do on the enchantments. Adding a 3rd slot would really open up a lot of opportunities for the Sorcerer. Maybe if this were to occur, they might have to nerf some of our other skills or take away damage somewhere, but I would be absolutely on board with that, because the enchantment system is what really makes this class fascinating. Well guys, that's just about all that I have to say about the Sorcerer in Diablo IV right now. Really hopeful for this class in the future, and I do plan on rolling it in Season 1 as well. I've had an absolutely great time. Go ahead and drop a comment down below. Let me know which class you're playing and how it's going for you. As always guys, I genuinely appreciate you for watching. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next one.